Welcome to UBI Unplugged, breaking down the future of income. Glad to have everyone tuning in today. We're diving into a really complex but crucial topic, UBI and the gig economy. It's like two huge waves crashing together, and we need to figure out how to navigate that.
Yeah, a navigate is putting it lightly. It feels more like we're trying to surf a tsunami made of algorithms and fluctuating wages. I mean, the gig economy is already such a mess, and then you throw UBI into the mix. It's a recipe for either total salvation or complete chaos. I can't decide which yet.
I think chaos is probably a bit strong, but I certainly agree that it's a complex picture. I mean, the promise of UBI is very appealing, especially when you look at the precarity inherent in a lot of gig work. But implementing it, making it work in a way that's beneficial and doesn't create other problems, that's the real challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's not just about the gig economy. Automation is also rapidly reshaping the landscape. UBI could be the safety net we desperately need as traditional jobs disappear. The gig economy, with its inherent instability, is a kind of canary in the coal mine. It shows the cracks in our current economic system.
See, that's where I get tripped up. It sounds great, a safety net for sure. But where's the money coming from? And what's to stop everyone from just, not working? Won't the whole thing collapse if no one is motivated to do anything?
That's a very valid concern. The funding question is critical, and it's not just about having enough money. It's about the economic impact of how that funding is generated. You could have massive tax implications. And the work disincentive, while it's a common argument against UBI, is something that needs very careful study. We don't have conclusive answers there yet. We need to consider what work means in a world where labor might not be the primary driver of production. I mean, is volunteer work or community organizing work in your definition?
Exactly. We need to move beyond this very narrow idea of what constitutes work. People are always going to find ways to be productive, to contribute to society. UBI isn't about giving people an excuse to do nothing. It's about giving them the freedom to pursue education, care for families, start a business, engage in the arts, and maybe, yes, sometimes, just to breathe a bit. The gig economy, for example, often traps people in this cycle of having to work constantly to make ends meet, and they don't have space to retrain, upskill, or move on to better things. That freedom is invaluable.
Okay, I get that, the freedom part. But even if people do all that cool stuff, what's the point if there isn't enough actual work being done? Will we just become a society of artists and hobbyists living off handouts? It sounds kind of unsustainable. And doesn't it create a massive inflation issue? Just pouring money into the system. We already have inflation. Can we afford this?
Those are definitely major points. Inflation is a key concern with any kind of large-scale fiscal policy change, and we have seen it in recent history. So, yeah, that requires a lot of modeling and thought. It wouldn't just be about giving money. It would require a complete rethink of our fiscal and monetary policies to prevent that. You are right, though. It's not just about giving money. It's about ensuring a sustainable economy where we're creating value and distributing it fairly. And we do need to think about the incentives that are created. It's not just a simple money drop. Maybe the solution is not UBI as we are talking about. Maybe some variant, maybe a negative income tax, maybe some hybrid system.
And that's the thing, right? It's not a simple switch. It's about how we structure it. UBI isn't just about giving everyone the same amount of money. It's about setting a basic income floor, then building on top of that with other programs. For example, you have to have affordable housing, education, and healthcare solutions so people can make best use of this basic income. So, the structure and the conditions around UBI are so critical. We can't just throw money at the problem, but we also can't ignore the fundamental changes happening in our economy. We need to look at the big picture, not just individual components.
Okay, big picture. I like that kind of. But it still feels like we're missing something. Like, we're talking about this ideal world where everyone is suddenly empowered and doing cool stuff and contributing. But people are messy and complicated. They might spend the UBI on junk. They might make bad choices. They might be exploited. I don't know. We need real-world examples, not just the idealistic stuff.
And I think you're right to be thinking about the practicalities and potential negative outcomes. You can't just assume it's all going to work perfectly. Look, there are lots of things that can go wrong. UBI is a big change. But it's not like the current system is perfect either. We already have huge problems with poverty, inequality, and precarious work. So when we talk about real-world examples, it's not about comparing some abstract utopia to a current reality that's already flawed. We need to be honest about what we are trying to fix.
And that's exactly why we should be looking at the trials that have happened in the real world. The Stockton trials in the US, for example, and the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. I know it was cut short, but it gave us real data. These are not perfect experiments, but we've seen that when people have a basic floor, they tend to make better choices. They're less likely to take any old job just to survive. They can invest in themselves, in their communities, and in their future. That is the crucial shift.
Okay, so we have trials seems different, and they are always on a small scale and for a limited time frame. It's kind of like a controlled lab experiment. When you take that small controlled experiment and implement it on a nationwide scale, it could be totally different. And what happens when the money runs out? What if we, as a society, decide this is too expensive? Then what? Are the poor going to get poorer again? You know we don't have an endless supply of taxpayer money, right?
And that's a key issue, sustainability. When we look at these trials, the devil is always in the details. You have to understand that you are not always going to see a perfect correlation. For the Stockton trials, for example, there's data suggesting that people were healthier, happier, and less stressed. But that doesn't always translate into measurable economic impacts. The Ontario trial did show real health benefits, but then we don't have the end results for the full trial. So we need more robust research and studies, as the data is not perfect and not all trials give us the results we want.
Yes, and the key is not to look for a perfect success metric. It's about understanding the trade-offs. Are we okay with a society that accepts a certain level of precarity and inequality? Or are we willing to try something different, even if it's not perfect? These pilot programs are a fantastic starting point, though. And yes, they are small scale, but we have to start somewhere and learn and adapt.
Okay, but the trials always seem to focus on the positive and no one wants to talk about the negative. We had the pandemic payments, right? The government sent out those payments for a few years. They were pretty much UBI light for many of us. And now people are drowning in debt and they still complain about how hard it is. They have this idea of a new standard of living they now want to maintain, and they can't. And we have high inflation and so on. We're trying to fix one problem with the other, and I am not sure it's the solution.
And that's a crucial point to bring up, because that's a great example where we can look at some of the pitfalls. Those pandemic payments weren't really UBI, were they? They weren't universal, they were targeted, and crucially, they were temporary. People are always going to struggle when there is not certainty. It's a key problem to figure out because people can't make good long-term choices if the support is not guaranteed.
And that's the difference, isn't it? UBI is not a temporary stimulus. It is a continuous safety net. Those pandemic payments did have unintended consequences, no question, especially when the tap was turned off. You can't build any sort of financial security on temporary, unpredictable payments. It's like taking away a crutch without giving anyone the time to strengthen their legs. And that's why UBI needs to be structured very differently. It needs to be reliable, predictable, and enough to live on, not just a Band-Aid.
So we are saying those pandemic payments were bad because they were not UBI. But how are we going to prevent the same thing happening if we implement a real UBI? You know, people getting used to a certain standard of living. And then if the government has to reduce it, it's going to create massive problems. I can see those problems already. We are looking at an increase in demand, and if the system can't keep up, we will have big inflationary pressures. So, in the end, how is UBI going to be better in the real world?
Exactly. And to add to that, it's about the kind of demand that UBI will create. It won't just be demand for stuff. It will also create demand for services, for education, for local businesses. People will have time to start new ventures and create new jobs. The gig economy, for example, is just one part of this future. UBI can give people the bargaining power to move away from exploitative gig work and pursue better options. We might even see the gig economy transform as businesses are forced to provide better work arrangements. This is all interconnected.
Okay, interconnected, yes, I can see that. And yeah, I can see how it might help people bargain better. But I mean, come on, aren't we forgetting something? The gig economy has grown so big because it's convenient for business. It is cheaper, it's flexible. Businesses can hire and fire as they need to. It's going to take more than UBI to change the way businesses operate. Won't they just find ways around it?
And that's a fantastic point. You're right. We also need policy and regulation changes to go alongside UBI. It's not a magic bullet, and it's not going to be a simple solution. So we might need stronger worker protections, a regulatory framework that protects people who are working on these gig platforms. The current gig model relies on an unequal balance of power, where the individual worker doesn't have much bargaining power. UBI can help, but it won't solve it completely. We need to look at the broader legal and regulatory context to make this whole thing work.
Right. And if you don't address those core imbalances in the system, UBI on its own might just be a subsidy to the gig companies, effectively. That's not the outcome we want. We want to see the value flow back to the workers and to the community. We don't want to see exploitation continue. It needs to be about worker empowerment. So a multi-pronged approach is what we need, not just a UBI approach. We have to consider policy adjustments to protect the workers.
Okay, I can see that. I mean, you need to control and regulate it all, but then isn't that just more government? And we are trying to solve the problem of an unequal economy. I don't think we can solve it with more government. It feels like we are going in circles here. The government gave out those pandemic payments and that created chaos. Now the solution is more government, but this time it's a UBI program. I'm still not convinced.
And I think it's important to keep that skepticism. It's healthy, and we should always be questioning whether the solutions being put forward are actually going to work in practice. We need to make sure we're thinking about the unintended consequences. And yeah, it does mean a bigger role for government in shaping the economy. We do need to ask ourselves what role we want the government to play in this new world.
And that's the question, right? Is it more government or smarter government? A UBI program can actually reduce the administrative burden in many cases. Think about all the bureaucracy and paperwork tied to our current welfare programs. So the complexity comes from changing from one system to another. Once it's implemented, the administration can actually be less complex. But yes, it requires a fundamental shift in how we view our economy and the relationship between citizens, the state, and the market. I mean, I do believe that we need to think beyond the traditional left versus right political ideologies.
Okay, less bureaucracy, I like that idea. But the idea of smarter government is a slippery slope. We always think government can be smart. But then we have the reality of how governments actually operate. And how do you protect against fraud? People always find ways to game the system. People did it with the pandemic payments. Why wouldn't they do it with UBI? We have to be honest about the potential for abuse.
And, that's a valid point. Fraud is a reality in any large program. But we also shouldn't assume that the only reason people are participating in the gig economy is because they are trying to game the system. We need to look at the incentives we are creating and ensure that we are designing systems that disincentivize fraud and exploitation. I think the problem with the pandemic payments wasn't just fraud, but it was poorly targeted and time limited.
Yes, and it's about creating a system that minimizes the opportunities for fraud in the first place. And yeah, people might game it. But if we create a system where people can actually live with dignity and have their basic needs met, I suspect that there will be a lot less incentive to cheat the system. And let's be clear, our current system is also plagued by fraud and abuse. The difference is who benefits from that fraud. It isn't the poor, that's for sure.
Okay, so less incentive to cheat. I can see that in theory, but in reality, it's a lot of trust. And I don't know if I can trust the system that much. And we've only been talking about the good side. What about the downsides? We've talked a little about inflation, but what about the other things that can go wrong? Won't that push people out of the workforce if they don't have to work? What about things like South Korea saying they don't want UBI? Are they dumb?
Well, first of all, we have to be careful about generalizing from one country to another. South Korea's economic context is very different from, say, the US or Europe, and their economy and their societal needs will differ greatly from one country to the next. We can't just take what happens in one country and apply it to every other. And also, the article is saying they are going for expansionary policy, not necessarily that they reject UBI for fundamental reasons. But I know what you are getting at. There are risks. A UBI that is not well designed could absolutely disincentivize people from working. And yeah, there will always be some people who won't be productive. And yeah, it's a big risk.
And that's why it's essential to design UBI with those risks in mind, and to not consider it as the only solution. We need to consider what is happening on a global level and adapt our policies to what is relevant to each context. And we need to have a robust debate about what constitutes a productive member of society. In a world where we are heading towards increased automation, our definition of work needs to change. We need to consider things like community work, education, and care work, as well as things that are more traditionally associated with work in an economic context.
Okay, that's good. So we need to redefine what we mean by work, I guess. But is UBI really the answer to all of this? Are we just putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound? Maybe we need something totally different. We have so much inequality. Is a flat cash payment the solution? I'm not so sure. I'm still not convinced, even after all this discussion.
Exactly. UBI is not a perfect solution, but it is a concept that forces us to ask hard questions. Questions about the future of work, about inequality, about what we value as a society. And yeah, there are risks, but the risks of doing nothing, of sticking with the status quo, those are even greater, in my view. We need to have a robust debate about UBI and to be willing to experiment and learn from our mistakes. But we also need to acknowledge that we do have a problem, and we need to be willing to fix it.
Well, I'm still skeptical, I have to say, but I can see we need to keep talking about this. I'm not convinced we found all the answers here, and I doubt we ever will. But I appreciate hearing the different perspectives. And it's clear we have a complex set of issues to solve. So, I guess that's it for now.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. It's a journey, not a destination, and we're just at the beginning of this conversation. And the important thing is we continue to question everything.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us today. And yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into these questions around the future of income. Until then, take care and keep the conversation going.